Hey, we are in our series called Influencers, and we kicked it off last week. If you weren't with us last week, we talked about how that there's this push, this drive in our culture today of many people to be what's known as influencers. And an influencer is somebody who pushes a platform, and they're on social media platforms. They are on YouTube or TikTok or Instagram primarily, and what they do is they try to gain followers to their channel and their page, and so that they can then push products. And we talked about how much money is in it for some of these people. I shared last week that the highest paid influencer is soccer player Cristiano Ronaldo, who gets paid $2.4 million every time he posts on Instagram, which is absolutely bonkers, right? Mr. Beast is a 25-year-old guy who made his living on YouTube. He's worth $500 million at 25 years old. So as many people are like, who would do that? 50 million plus people in our world are at some stage of trying to be an influencer in our world. And so it's prevalent, and if some of you are struggling with understanding that, come and talk to this crew right here, and they'll explain influencer to you because they got it figured out. They had it all last week. But in this series, we're not talking about those people. We're talking about some somewhat obscure characters in the Old Testament through their humble attributes became actual influencers and pushed forward the storyline of God. The drive of many modern-day influencers is the drive to be known, to be the desire to have attention pointed at them, the spotlight on them. They have their name or the name of their channel or account or their page followed by millions of people. It's an attention. It is driven by for many people. Looking at themselves. Today we're going to talk about a humble influencer who for the most part was content with being a humble helper. A humble helper. Although you'll probably recognize his name, in most stories about him in the Bible, he's not the main guy. But what he does is he comes alongside the main guy and he just helps. He just finds places and finds ways to help the main guy. Today we're talking about a guy named Aaron. And again, if you guys guess it over there? No. Oh, you guys got it wrong? Okay. There's always like a guessing game happening down here, and so every time I say something and I'll hear this, oh, or ooh, I know that I've either hit on something or not. That's just a little insight into the games that get played during sermon. Again, we're saying, I'm sure that back in the Old Testament, they wore hello, my name is name tags around just so everybody could identify them. But today we're talking about Aaron. And Aaron, in many ways, changes the whole storyline of history. And yet he's relatively unknown. Sure, if you grew up in church, if you've been around church, if you've read through your Bible, you've heard of this guy, Aaron, before, but he's never really the spotlight guy. He's never really the guy with the spotlight on him. And today we're going to use Aaron's example, the life of Aaron, to highlight a couple of different traits about what humble helpers look like. If you have your sermon notes, you can grab them out in your bulletin, and you can write down, first of all, the first trait of a humble helper, the first characteristic of the profile of somebody who is a helper is this. Humble helpers are willing to be used by God even if they don't receive the accolades. Humble helpers are willing to be used by God even if they don't receive the accolades. Aaron was the older brother of a guy named Moses. You've probably heard of him before. Even people who have not been raised in church, grown up in church, been around church, you recognize the name Moses. And Moses is well known by everyone. In fact, I was looking this up and I was just kind of curious about it. Moses is listed on most lists of most influential people in all of history. like secularists. In fact, in one of the most popular books written about the 100 most influential people in human history, Moses is ranked 15, the 15th most influential person in all of history. But I really believe this: without Aaron's humble influence in the life of Moses, we might not know who Moses is today. Because Moses was about to quit before he even got started. Moses was ready to throw in the towel. Moses had undercut himself so much, and he didn't really want what God was asking him to do. And if not for Moses, or if not for Aaron, we might not know who Moses is. A quick history so that we're all just kind of on the same page. You should really go back, though, and read through the entire book of Exodus this week. It's a fascinating read through these characters. And we know that Moses was born. He's a Hebrew, born during the time where the Hebrew people, the nation of Israel, was in slavery in Egypt. And Moses was born into that, born to a Hebrew mother. But there was a time in that history where they were killing the babies in Egypt, the Hebrew babies born in Egypt. And so Moses' mother had Moses in secret and then placed him in a basket. And we know this story, right? She put the basket out in the Nile River, and the basket came down and was picked up by Pharaoh's daughter. Moses was raised in the palace by Pharaoh's, was raised in privilege in the palace of Egypt, raised around royalty, but all the while his people were in slavery still. And so Moses felt conflicted. He felt this conflicting feeling because he was a Hebrew. He knew he was a Hebrew, but he was raised in the palace, and yet he looked out and saw that his people were being tortured, were being beaten, were being killed, were being forced into labor. That got to Moses, and so one day he was out and about, and he saw an Egyptian beating one of the Israelites, and he couldn't take it anymore, so he killed the Egyptian, went out and buried his body. And then he was fearful of people finding out of this, and so he flees Egypt, and he goes out and he lives in the desert area for 40 years. He gets married out there, and he ends up working for his father-in-law, keeping the flocks. And that's a real Reader's Digest version of that. You should go read Exodus. And God appears to Moses, though, through a burning bush, and a couple other signs. And basically what God was telling him through these experiences, he begins telling Moses, I have chosen you. I want you to go, and I want you to go back into Egypt. And I want you to be the catalyst that gets my people out of slavery and leads them eventually into a better place, into a promised land. God heard the groanings of the people in slavery, his people in slavery, and so he sets forth a plan to get them out of slavery. And here's where we pick up the story in Exodus chapter 4. God comes to Moses in miraculous ways, and he says, I want you to go do this amazing thing. And here's what Moses says. But Moses said to the Lord, Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and of tongue. Then the Lord said to him, Who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth, and I will teach you what you shall speak. But he said, Oh, my Lord, please send someone else. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, Is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you both what to do. He shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff with which you shall do the signs. Moses was looking for every way possible to get out of what God was asking him to do, right? Like, not many people argue with God in this way and live to talk about it. But basically, God says, hey, I want you to go do this. And he's like, God, I can't talk. I don't talk well. I can't talk good. That's what he's saying. I stutter. I can't talk. That's what he's telling God. And God's like, listen, I know you. I created you. I know who you are. And he says, yeah, but I just can't do it. God was calling him, and Moses felt inadequate. He felt like he lacked what it took to do what God was calling him to do. Side note, this is how many people that you perceive to be great leaders feel. That behind most great leaders that you see out there, there is an area of inadequacy that they feel. That's a side note. We don't have time to run down that rabbit trail. But just know, and this was the case for Moses, this great leader, 15th most influential person in all of history, and yet before he even got started, he was looking for a way out. He didn't want to do what God was asking him to do. But I love what verse 14 says. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, not that part. And he said, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. God was angry with Moses because Moses wasn't showing faith that God already knew what his shortcomings and his inadequacies were, and that he didn't have the faith to know that God had a plan for that. So he's angry with Moses because he wasn't showing faith. But he already knew that Moses didn't speak well. He already knew that Moses had a stutter. He already knew Moses' inadequacies before Moses even said them. Why? Because he created him. And he knew him. And before he even started talking to Moses about what the plan was, he was already talking to Aaron about coming out to meet his brother. Notice he says, listen, I know you can't speak. Behold, he is coming out to meet you. In other words, Moses, I already know, and I've got a plan on the way. I know your shortcomings. I know your inadequacies. I know where you fall short, and I've got a plan for that already. You need to walk in faith. But I want to look at, from the rest of this sermon, about Aaron's point of view. It'd be easy to keep tracking with Moses, and there's a lot of sermons, there's a lot of great sermons that can be said about Moses, but we're looking at Aaron today. We don't know how or God called him or communicated. He goes out to meet his brother. What we do know is that he obeyed God and he went out to help his younger brother. Did you notice that order? That Aaron's the oldest. Aaron's the one that has been in Egypt this whole time. Aaron's been around this whole time, and he's the one that should have been he could have felt like he was the one that should have been chosen by God. He's the older brother, and yet God chose the younger brother, Moses. Just a side note, this is a theme that's going to be seen throughout all of our series, is that often God switches up the order. God approved Abel's offering, loved Abel's offering, but not Cain's, the older brother. God chose Moses, the younger brother, and set up Aaron, the older brother, as the helper. And we're going to see throughout this series that God does this often. So God comes to Aaron, and he says that he wants him to go out and help his brother out. And God used him in a powerful way to help Moses ultimately free the nation of Israel, lead them out right to the precipice of the promised land. And we see over the next several chapters of Exodus, if you read through the next several chapters, what you see is Aaron. Every time you see Moses standing there, you see Aaron standing right next to him. Every time Moses does something great, Aaron is right by his side, helping him in whatever ways possible. When they come down and they talk to Pharaoh and say, God says, let my people go. And Pharaoh says, I don't think so. I kind of like this situation where I have slaves working for me. And then God begins to do miraculous things and sends the plagues. Every single time we see Moses show up, Aaron's standing right next to him. He gets to be right there next to him and witness all the amazing miracles. God uses him to speak on behalf of Moses because he was more eloquent with words. And yet, Aaron is not on the top 100 most influential people in all of human history. He's not even on the list. But we find Moses there. And that's how it is often to be a humble influencer. Humble influencers don't care about the platform or the limelight or the attention or the accolades. They're people who just want to make a difference and ultimately live in obedience to whatever God's called them to. And those are people who make actual influence in our world. Friends, there's a lot of impact and difference you can make when your name's not in lights, even when you don't receive the praise or the accolades. And Aaron shows that to us, that he was standing next to his brother, doing whatever it would take to make a difference in the world, because ultimately he wanted to see his people go as well, to see his people free. And so he was willing to do whatever it took to push forward that storyline of God. So the first thing that we see, the first profile of a humble helper, is that humble helpers are willing to be used by God even if they don't receive the accolades. And the second thing that humble helpers do is recognize their gifts and role in God's kingdom. They recognize their gifts and role in God's kingdom. Aaron was called by God to accept his role as a helper, and God honored him for that. There's this little verse in Hebrews chapter 5, and in Hebrews chapter 5, the writer of Hebrews is talking about how Jesus is the great high priest. And ultimately, Aaron, because he was a Levite, when God set up his nation, he set up priests to intercede. Aaron became the first high priest. He became the first high priest of Israel. But here in Hebrews chapter 5, I love what it says here. No one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. I love that little phrase. He's talking about this high priest and this call to being a high priest, and ultimately how Jesus was the great high priest. But he's talking about here that no one takes this honor up for themselves, but people who are called by God. Aaron, just like Aaron was. Aaron knew his role. Aaron knew his gifting from God, and that he was called many times to be a humble helper. Have you ever thought about this? Why? Why did God have Aaron come to be the mouthpiece for Moses? Why, instead of forcing Moses to suffer through kind of humiliation of not being able to speak well, the anxiety of having a speech impediment, why didn't God just heal Moses? He could have just freed his lips so he didn't have a speech impediment, that he could just speak freely. Why did he send Aaron to be the mouthpiece? I think God's solution for Aaron as translator for Moses was, one, for Moses to learn humility, to learn how to work with his brother. Two, for Aaron's role, so we can see how a humble helper comes alongside. But I think there's another reason for it as well. because Aaron could uniquely relate to the Hebrew people in slavery. I had never thought about this until this week in studying this. And I actually was reading through a Jewish rabbi's thoughts on Moses and Aaron. And he brought up this interesting point that Moses was a Hebrew, but he wasn't raised like the rest of the Hebrews in slavery. Moses was raised in the palace. Moses was raised as an adopted son of Pharaoh and Pharaoh's daughter. He was raised in that palace. Aaron wasn't. And although Moses certainly had the heart for his people, he didn't know what it was like to get beat with rods. He didn't know what it was like to carry the weight of bricks to build the infrastructure that the slaves were building in Egypt. And God knew that Moses, although he had a heart for his nation, for his people, he couldn't relate the way Aaron could relate. And so, as much as Aaron was a helper for Moses when he was in front of Pharaoh, Aaron was also a helper when it came to talking to the nation of Israel, the Hebrew people, because he was able to uniquely identify with them. Aaron was able to come alongside and bridge this gap between Moses and the slaves. And that's what humble helpers do. They come in and they recognize their role to fill the gaps and the holes, to fill in and to work in the spaces that God's called them to work. Whether that's in a family setting or a ministry setting or a work setting or wherever God puts them, humble helpers come and look to provide influence, not in a flashy, look at me way, I need the attention way, but rather just filling in the blind spots, filling in the holes and the gaps in these areas. Beth does this in such an amazing way in our family and in so many ways in my life. That she comes alongside, and because I have so many blind spots and holes and gaps and areas that I don't see and fill. And man, Beth just does a great job of coming around and filling those in, helping me see a different perspective, lovingly coming up and saying, hey, could you, when it comes to our kids or when it comes to our family life, or she just comes and in such a humble way helps me in so many ways. I couldn't be the man I am today without my wife coming and doing this humble helping and just building up, supporting and encouraging and filling in the gaps. I wouldn't be in ministry today if it wasn't for my wife kind of filling in those things and helping me. I certainly wouldn't be the father today that I am because she does this in such a beautiful, humble way. When I look at what a humble helper is, I see her in the way that she moves and works to fill in the gaps. When I think about what a humble helper is, I think about so many people here at the church for ministry. And I've talked about this so many times before that this church is, it's not just, it doesn't rest on me. It's not just about me. It's not about what this is right here, this role. It's about you. It's about the way you guys come in and fill so many beautiful roles in the church and how we can work together. This doesn't go so well right now. This gets a lot more chaotic, what's happening right here, if there wasn't amazing, humble helpers back on that side of the building who right now are just lovingly watching our babies and our preschoolers. This would be a whole lot more chaotic and noisy, right? If they weren't back there helping right now. What happens in this room doesn't happen without our deacons who come in and fill the roles and do their jobs beautifully. It doesn't happen without the people who come in and clean the building. It doesn't happen without the people who lovingly teach our kids. It doesn't happen without those who come around and encourage, those who are weekly praying for and checking in on. And although you guys may not be called to do what I do, standing right here, right? In most ways, this church doesn't push forward without your guys' beautiful, humble, helping hearts. We don't exist as a church without humble helpers. And I pray that in the areas of ministry and the ways that Beth comes around me and the ways that our family life when I'm not, or in the church when in ministry when I'm not called to be the leader, that I can be a helper and that I can do what so many humble helpers do for me for that person's ministry. Because sometimes it's because I'm not in the role of leader all the time. In so many ways, and this is how we're trying to set this up as a church, that in a lot of ways, there are people in charge and over me. And I just want to come and be a humble helper under them. Because the role of humble helper is vital for any ministry, any family, any workplace to succeed. And Aaron shows that off so well, coming in and helping bridge the gaps and the holes. And although Aaron was not perfect, and it's not like he didn't have any faults. In fact, if you know the story of Aaron, there's a couple times where he got jealous of his brother Moses' position. And he got a little upset a couple times. And then he made a really big mistake when he created and formed a golden image for the people to worship while Moses was up on Mount Sinai. Aaron was not without fault, and he didn't do it perfectly all the time. But I think that's beautiful in itself because that means that you and I, we don't have to do it perfectly. But Aaron's heart was in the right place. Aaron wanted to come alongside and be a humble helper for his brother. And brings us to the third and final. Humble helpers just do whatever is needed to help. And some of you are like, well, obviously. I mean, duh, Joel. Like, yeah, of course that's what it means, right? Humble helpers just do whatever it takes to help. Of course, right? That should be a no-brainer. You just defined helper with help. English teachers are struggling right now. That's okay. Because what may sound obvious in a sermon, I find is sometimes a lot harder to live out in a world of me first. I want the attention. I think I should have position. I think I should have my name in lights. So what's easier to say sometimes is harder to live out. Let's fast forward a little bit to Exodus chapter 17. And one of the most amazing displays of what a humble helper is, we find Aaron and another guy named Hur, H-U-R, really showing what a humble influencer is all about. This would, let's just read it and then we'll talk about it. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow we will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hands, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and they put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side, so that his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. I love this scene that takes place here. This was the first battle that took place for the nation of Israel after they came out of Egypt, and everything was coming up Israel at that point. Right? God had just split the Red Sea. They had walked through on dry ground. The sea collapsed on the Egyptians. They got to the other side. They had worshiped God. They were just setting out on this, and then all of a sudden Amalek comes down, and he's like, "Oh, you're not taking my land. You're not coming through here." So they go to battle, and this is the first time these Hebrews had gone into battle, and so Moses tells Joshua, "Hey, I want you to go lead this fight, and I'm going to go up on this hill. I'm going to hold up the staff of God, the same staff of God that parted the Red Sea just a little bit ago, right? The same staff of God that did amazing miracles in Egypt with the plagues to finally let the people go. That same staff that Moses held as he walked through the desert with. He's like, I'm going to take this staff." And he realized when Moses got to the top of the hill the next day, the battle was going on. Moses realized something. Every time I hold this staff up, our people are winning the battle. When my hands drop down, we begin losing. Have you ever tried just holding your hands up for a long period of time? Just no weight even. Just put your hands up and hold them up for as long as you can. Even the weight of your arms gets heavy after a little bit, right? And not as long as you would think, right? You hold your hands up and they start to get tired. And Moses was trying to do his part to win this battle and show that it was actually God who was fighting for them, but it was dependent on him raising his hands with the staff in his hands. And as he grew tired, they began losing. Aaron and Hur recognize this quickly, so they go and find a rock for Moses to sit on. And then they did what humble helpers do. They went and they just held his hands up. They held his arms up so that they could win this battle. A couple things about this, right? They knew that they couldn't be Moses. It's not like Aaron could say, "Here, Moses, give me the staff and I'll hold it up." They knew that wouldn't work, right? So they figured out the next best thing was to be able to stand there and support Moses while he did his job. They could do their job so that Moses could do his job. And they stood there and held his hands up. Put yourself in this spot, right? They stood there all day. All day. Like, have you ever stood in the same spot for even an hour and just stood there? Let alone all day long. Moses sat here. They just sat and held his arms up for a whole day. That's some dedication. That's some dedication to helping. That's finding the gaps. That's finding the voids and filling them. And that's what humble helpers do. It wasn't an easy job, but they were there for it. And they supported Moses in what God called him to do by doing what they could do. And because of that, Israel won the battle. I know we don't care about this anymore as a society, by and large. But every year, the Academy Awards present this Oscar, right? And I know that nobody cares about this anymore. But they have these awards, right? These award ceremonies, and save yourself some time. Don't watch them. They're lame. But they always, the Oscar, they have an Oscar award for best actor or actress, right? And they give out, and that's the most prized award in Hollywood in film, right? Is the best actor or actress. People are gunning that all year, trying to find the right film, the right movie to be in, and have the right performance in that movie, so that they could be named and win the Oscar for best actor or actress. But each year, there's also an award for Best Supporting Actor and Best Supporting Actress. And these are given to people who aren't always known as the best or the biggest stars. They aren't necessarily household names or make the largest salaries, but are recognized because if they didn't do their job, then the movie wouldn't go off. The movie wouldn't have been as successful as it was. Or if they didn't do their job, the star of the movie couldn't do their job. And while everybody is kind of gunning for best actor, best actress, sometimes supporting roles, they're what really make the movies go off, right? And you know this too, because if you ever watch these things, and when the person wins an award, if you ever watch an award ceremony, right, they get up there and they thank everybody under the sun, right? Until the little thing, they have to like take a shepherd's staff and grab them by the neck and rip them off the stage, right? Because they go through the whole list of everybody and it's kind of right that they do that, right? Because at least they're recognizing that they don't stand on their own. They don't get to the spot. They don't get to this role, to win this best actor or best actress by themselves, that there are hundreds of people that make that possible. Right? And this is what we see Aaron doing. This is what we see every humble helper do. And I think that there's awards. I'm just thinking about this now as I'm saying it. It's kind of funny. If there was an awards ceremony in heaven, that's weird. It's not theologically correct. So go with me on this, right? But if there's an award ceremony in heaven, and Moses won an award for best, Old Testament character, I don't know, 15th most influential person in all of history, I don't know. But if he was to stand up, I'll bet you the first thing he says is, I want to thank my brother Aaron, who walked beside me, who God sent to me when I was questioning everything about myself. While we were in Egypt, he was right by my side. I couldn't have done it without him. When we were out in the wilderness and I was going through low spots, he was there to support me. He filled in the gaps for me. On that day when I sat there and I couldn't hold my arms up any longer, my brother came and just held my arms up and enabled us to continue forward. Those long days where we walked around the desert together, I couldn't have gone through it without my brother. That's the heart of a humble helper. That's what Aaron did for his brother. And they became a dynamic duo in God's story, and they both needed each other. And we need people in our lives like that. We need people that can come beside us in our lives and hold up our arms when we get tired, who can walk us through and support us when life is not going well. And we also need to be that for other people. So maybe more than even asking, do you have somebody like that in your life? I want to ask, are you being that for somebody else in their life? Are you being that for your spouse? Are you being that humble helper that comes alongside and fills in the gaps in a loving way and encourages them and blesses them? Are you plugged into some role of ministry where you're coming alongside of and filling holes and gaps and being just a humble helper? Because what we learned from Aaron is, although his name was not in the lights, and although many people today don't know who he is, what we find is that like so many humble helpers who've come after him, he just came alongside and did whatever it takes to influence the story of God. Can you be that for somebody else? How is God calling you in the circles you are in to be a humble helper? Because humble influences teach us that serving God is worth it even when we don't receive recognition.